change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of Acts. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh, oh.
And then Paul, he begins what sounds like that customary flattery. But everything that Paul says here is true. And he means it all very sincerely when he says, I think myself happy, King Agrippa, because I will answer for myself before you concerning all the things I'm accused of by the Jews, especially because you are an expert in all customs and questions which have to do with the Jews. Where this isn't empty flattery, because it's all true. King Agrippa was an expert in everything Jewish, where up until now, Paul, he's been appearing before pagan Gentile governors. He's been appearing to guys like Felix and Festus, where they didn't understand any of the Jewish things, but Agrippa, he does. And so Paul starts and he says, therefore, I beg you to hear me patiently. And what he's meaning here and what he's letting King Agrippa know is that this is not going to be brief. And so what he's asking King Agrippa to do is to be patient with him. And this is Paul's longest address in the book of Acts. And you kind of know this is going to be long with him starting by saying, my manner of life from my youth. And you think, oh my word, he's going to go all the way back to his youth. So you know this is going to be long because Paul's an older man here. Can't you just start from about 2 years ago, Paul? Like about the time of the riot? But Paul's in control now, and we're going to hear Paul's whole life story. And you would think Paul, being given this chance to defend himself from the charges he's been accused of, that he would start by defending himself. That's what he would address here. But that's not what he does. Paul, he sees this as an opportunity to give his testimony again. And this is the third time in the book of Acts that Paul has given his testimony. And so he starts here again by telling Agrippa his credentials, that he was raised a Pharisee, that he's a Jew, taught as a Jew in the strictest sense of being a Jew, which is being a Pharisee, and which is not something that many people could claim. And Agrippa, he would know everything about the sect of the Pharisees in Judaism. And Agrippa, he's heard of Paul. And Agrippa, he would know the Pharisees' view on things like the resurrection and on the Christ, about their hope and the promises made by God. He would even know about Jesus. And here in verse 7, Paul mentions the 12 tribes of Israel, where Jesus, he also mentioned the 12 tribes of Israel in the book of Matthew in chapter 19. And James, the apostle James, he mentioned the 12 tribes of Israel when addressing his letter. Where it seems obvious here that the 10 tribes of Israel, that they're not lost, like some people claim, that they've been assimilated into Israel, that they're not lost at all, but that God knows exactly where they are. And then Paul starts here by stating about the resurrection, that it's not odd, not to Jews. It may seem odd to the Gentiles here, but not to Agrippa and Bernice. And Paul tells them that he didn't used to think that the resurrection had anything to do with Jesus. And so he persecuted anything to do with Jesus' name, Jesus the Nazarene. And Paul confesses here that in his former life as a Pharisee, he killed Christians and he sent them to their death. And then here in verse 10, where it says, cast my vote. This is the place where we know that Paul was an official voting member of the Sanhedrin, though there are some people who don't think so, because they think that if Paul was an official member, that he would have mentioned it way before in one of his letters. But Paul says that he was so enraged that he followed the followers of Jesus to other cities. And that's where, on the road to Damascus, where Paul saw the light. a light that was brighter than the sun. And he tells us that this was at midday. So this means this was at noon when the sun was at its brightest. And that's when he heard a voice, where those that were with him, they saw the light and they heard a sound, but they didn't hear a voice. They couldn't make out the words. And it says here that it was in the Hebrew language, where some people, they believe that Jesus spoke to Paul in Aramaic, which was the common language of the Hebrew people. But it could have been Hebrew because Paul, he spoke Hebrew. But the two things which become obvious to Paul here at this time, one is that Jesus is alive, and the second is that Jesus is connected to the suffering of his people, the church, and that by persecuting the church, Paul persecuted the Messiah. And I really don't know if people get that today, that when they speak against the church, that they're actually speaking against Jesus. And what you see here is how gracious Jesus is when he's speaking to his enemies, because you have to realize Paul, he's Jesus's enemy here. And Jesus reveals that he's been working in Paul's life for a while now, but that Paul, he's been fighting him, that he's been kicking against a goad, which means he's kicking against sharp sticks that are meant to keep oxen going in the right direction. And so he's basically saying that Paul here, that he's more stubborn than an ox. And then after Jesus tells Paul who he is and that he is the Christ, then he tells Paul to stand on his feet. And then he told him that he appeared to Paul to make him a minister of what's been made known to him. And you might think here, oh, Jesus made him a man of respect. He made him a minister. But that Greek word there used for minister is the word under-rower. So this looks like the slaves in the movie Ben-Hur, who are all chained in those galley ships with long oars roaring at the beat of a drum. But Paul here, he's not on the top deck. He's not with the fresh air. He's a bottom decker. He's the lowest of the slaves. He's the first to be drowned if something happens to the ship. And then in verse 16, the Greek word for witness is the word for martyr, where Jesus is saying that Paul will be his martyr. But Jesus, he also promises Paul that he will deliver him from the Jews and the Gentiles. And then Jesus says, to whom I now send you. And what's really funny here, this is exactly what Paul said at the temple when the riot broke out. And now here, Paul, he says it, and there's no riot, and nobody gets upset. Nothing happens. And that's because they're all Gentiles here. And it was just that one word Gentile that threw the Jews in Jerusalem in such a fury because of their prejudice, thinking that God could love the Gentiles as much as them and bring salvation to Gentiles. Where Paul's mission was to open their eyes, to turn them from darkness to light, to deliver them from Satan to God, where they could also receive an inheritance in God. And that's what the Jews hated. And now Paul tells Festus and Agrippa that he wasn't disobedient to his heavenly vision, and that's when the Jews seized him. That's when they tried to kill him. And that he said nothing that Moses hadn't said or that the prophets hadn't said, and that the Christ would suffer and die and be raised from the dead. And so after Paul gives his testimony and he makes his defense, Festus, he just interrupts and he just blurts out in a loud voice in the middle of the auditorium, in the middle of this event, with all these finely dressed people around, and he yells, Paul, you're crazy. You're out of your mind. Your learning has made you mad. But if Festus, if he really thought Paul was mad, he would have had him carried out. But with Festus saying this, Paul, he had to reply to King Agrippa, where he first turns to Festus and he says politely, and he calls him most noble Festus, because Paul knows that Festus, he doesn't understand these things. And that's because he's a pagan. And then he tells Festus that King Agrippa, he understands all these things, that these things, they didn't happen in secret. They were all public. They weren't done in a corner. They weren't hidden. And none of this has escaped King Agrippa. And then Paul, he turns to Agrippa and he addresses him directly. And he first just asks him, he says, do you believe the prophets? And then Paul, either by him being given a word of knowledge from God, or else maybe it's just obvious where Paul, he's bold enough to say, I know you do. And there I just stop for just a second. And I think about that and I say, oh yes, he does. He does believe the prophets, just like his father did when he killed James, and his grandfather when he beheaded John the Baptist, and just like his grandfather did when the Magi came and he believed the prophets. And that's why he killed all the babies when he tried to kill Jesus. It's all because they believed them. And it was just like Drusilla a couple weeks ago, where she wanted to hear Paul because she also believed the prophets. All the Herods believed the prophets. They just didn't get saved. Just like King Agrippa here, he doesn't get saved. And where he says to Paul, you almost persuade me to become a Christian, but almost isn't good enough. In fact, knowing and not acting on what you know, it doesn't help you. It actually harms you. But what I see here is that even with these backwards, fleshy, wicked, immoral family that are full of incest and idolatry for all these generations, going all the way back to Esau, that God, he's still trying to reach them. He's still trying to save them, but they refuse to come. Where God has not only sent his messengers, he sent his very best. He sent them the Magi. He sent them the prophets. He sent them the apostles and Jesus Christ himself, where they believe, but they're just unwilling to come. And so now Paul, he turns from King Agrippa and he turns to all the other prominent leaders, all the military personnel that are present. And now he addresses them and he says, I would to God that not only you, but also all who hear me today might become as I am, except these chains. And I don't know if you've ever seen people who've been moved by the truth and who are under conviction but still don't come. But that's what it's like here for Festus and Agrippa and Bernice. And now they're all sitting there and they're all talking among themselves. And they know that Paul is innocent and that he should have been freed, which seems like everybody has already known this for about 2 years. And then you have King Agrippa saying to Festus, he's basically saying, sorry, I wish I could help you, but I can't find any charges here to send with Paul to the Caesar. And that's because there's nothing there. But now Paul, he still has to go to Caesar, but this was God's plan all along. Where Paul, he makes this very clear in his letters that he is not a prisoner of Rome, but that he is actually a prisoner of the Lord Jesus Christ. And the truth is if Paul wasn't in Roman custody, he would have never made it to Rome. He would have been killed. He would have been dead. Where God is using the Roman guards here to keep Paul alive. And so now sending Paul to Rome and having Rome paying all the expenses, where it kind of looks like Paul is the prisoner here with King Agrippa being the judge, but it's actually Paul here who's the real judge. Because what he's doing is he's showing all these people who are prisoners, who are imprisoned by their darkness, he's showing them the truth and he's showing them the way to freedom. But they've all closed their eyes to the truth. Okay, so now Paul, he leaves for Rome. They'll never see him again. They've now lost their opportunity to receive Christ with Paul. But we don't want that for any of us here, because we've all heard Paul's testimony too. And if anyone here wants to receive Christ to be their Savior, all you have to do is come up here after and we'll pray. So last week, we left the Apostle Paul unable to receive justice as a Roman citizen in the lower Roman courts, where after 2 years in custody and imprisoned at the palace in Caesarea, and after 2 court trials before 2 Roman governors, and with 1 hearing before a king, Paul has now appealed to Caesar, which was his right as a Roman, where at this time the emperor was Nero. So now Paul is being transported as a prisoner in chains, and he's given into the custody of a Roman centurion named Julius. And here we're told that he's not Julius's only prisoner, but he is the only prisoner who has appealed to Caesar for a new trial in Caesar's appellate court. Because it says here, some other prisoners. The Greek word here means others of a different kind, which means that these other prisoners have already been convicted. And these are those who have committed capital crimes who are on their way to be executed. And so you may wonder and you say, well, why are they being transported to Rome to be executed? Because couldn't Rome have executed them in their own local provinces? Well, the answer to that is yes. But where would be the fun in that? Because these condemned prisoners are most likely being transported to Rome to die in the arena, like the kind of games that they used to have in the Colosseum. But at this time, the Colosseum hadn't been built yet. It'll be built in 81 AD, so it's not too far off in the future. But these prisoners will probably die by either wild animals or by gladiators for Rome's entertainment. And Paul here, he'll have a long time to get to know these men. So they're going to probably hear all about the salvation found in Jesus Christ. And then here in verse 2, it says that they entered in a Dramaton ship, which only means where the ship is from, which is by the island of Lesbos in Western Asia. So this would be a smaller freighter grain ship. It's the kind of ship that would have had just one small square sail that wouldn't be able to sail against the wind. So this ship would be about 140 feet long and 36 feet wide. And it wouldn't have a rudder, but it would have just two paddles in the back to steer with. And these ships were used to deliver supplies up and down the coastline, and they weren't made for the open seas. And so what Julius is doing here by traveling on these smaller ships is that he's trying to get to a larger city where he can find a ship that's large enough to go straight to Rome. So it's kind of like taking those little hopper flights, trying to get to a larger airport to get a non-stop flight. Where these larger type ships, you can't even find them in the smaller cities. So you can't even find them in the cities like Caesarea. And then we also hear in verse 2 where we read, "We put to sea," which means that Dr. Luke, in his humble way, he's saying that he's going with Paul. And this is probably as his personal physician. And it's not only Luke that's with Paul, but we also see that Aristarchus is probably going along as Paul's assistant, where Paul, in his letter to the Colossians, he mentions Aristarchus as being a fellow prisoner. But here with Aristarchus, on his part, it was all voluntary. Okay, so now they sail on the smaller ship 80 miles to Sidon. And Sidon is in Lebanon. And that would have taken them about a day and a half. And then in Sidon, Paul was given the freedom to meet with other believers who provided for Paul and his crew. Where then from Sidon, they sailed to Myra, which we see here that the winds, they're already bad for sailing. And that's why they're sailing between the island of Cyprus and the mainland, because they usually would sail on the outside of Cyprus. And then when they get to Myrna, which is in Turkey, Julius the centurion found an Alexandrian ship, which means it's from Alexandria, Egypt. And this ship was going straight to Italy. Where this ship too, it would be taking grain to Rome, because Egypt at this time was the breadbasket of the Roman Empire, where it produced a lot of their grain. And so this is a large ship for its day. And so it's about 180 feet long and 45 feet wide. And so this ship would be able to handle the open seas. So this ship is not only carrying the grain for Rome, but it also has enough room to carry these 276 passengers that come on board. And what you need to realize here is that they're taking off late in the year. This is toward the end of sailing season, because the westerly winds have already begun to blow. And so their travel is slow. where it tells us it took them many days to get to Fair Havens, which is on the island of Crete, which is usually only a short trip, where Fair Havens is about 500 miles from Myra, but here it's taken them about 15 days. And so now, with this ship at the port at Fair Havens, everybody's aware that they're not going to make it to Rome this year, not before the winter has passed. Because here we're told that the fast is already over. And the fast that they're talking about here is Yom Kippur. They're talking about the Jewish Day of Atonement, where the actual date of this actual year would have been October 5th in the year of 59 AD, where any time after September 14th, it was always dangerous to sail on the Mediterranean Sea. And it will stay that way, and it'll remain dangerous up until November 11th. But then after November 11th, all sailing is shut down, because after November 11th, the sea became impossible to sail, and it stays that way until after February. And for some reason, Paul, he is being brought into this discussion on moving the ship, where Paul, he's not an expert on sailing, but Paul does have a lot of experience on being shipwrecked, because we know from 2 Corinthians 11 that had already been written by this time, Paul has already survived 3 shipwrecks, where he spent one time a whole day and a night in the sea waiting to be rescued. And so at this time, Paul, he's been on at least 11 ship journeys, and he's traveled over 3,500 miles by sea. But for most, Fair Havens is not the kind of port that you want to harbor your ship in for the winter, with one of the reasons being it's just a small town, so there's not much to do in the winter. But it also has a shallow harbor, and it's open to the sea, and so it receives a good brunt of the winter storms. And so Paul, he has a word of warning for them. And here he doesn't say it's from God, but that doesn't mean that it's not from God, because all of what Paul says here would have come true if God had not intervened. But here in verse 10, the Greek word that Paul uses here for perceived, it means to perceive from past experience. So Paul, he perceives from his past experience that there will be a loss of cargo, the ship, and their lives. But the ship owner and the ship's captain, they don't see it that way. And they're the experts here. And so Julius, the centurion, who's in charge, he'd rather listen to them, because they're only going to try to go 40 miles to Phoenix, which is just around the corner on the island of Crete, which would only take them a few hours. So this is sort of a 3-hour tour. But we've seen from Gilligan's Island that a 3-hour tour can end up quite crazy, where it didn't really work out for the skipper, Gilligan. But Phoenix, it was a larger town, and it had a deeper port with more protection from the storms. And so Paul, his advice is disregarded, and it seems to them that they made the right decision, because the weather did change, and things began so perfectly, where here it looks like Paul was wrong, where now they have this gentle, soft wind beginning to blow from the west. It's just exactly what they needed. But then the soft wind turns into a tempestuous wind.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,